Hi, and welcome back. So yeah, what actually is a compander? Well, in fact, it's a concatenation of two words you're probably more familiar with: compressor and expander. First, the signal is compressed to reduce the dynamic range. Then, in a separate process, it's expanded again to restore the original dynamic range. In between the two processes will be something that can't handle the original dynamic range of the signal, like a radio microphone system or a tape recorder. Reducing the dynamic range of the signal hitting tape makes it easier to keep the signal level comfortably above the noise floor without driving the tape too hard and distorting. These types of noise reduction systems could significantly improve the dynamic range of tape recording and were widely adopted. So now I've answered the question in the title, you can stop watching. Except you might want to stick around for the more interesting question. Why would U-He bother to model this type of noise reduction in their Satin tape emulation plugin? After all, we can just dial down the noise level if it's too much. The short answer to that one is the same reason they bother to model the tape itself, because it changes the sound and often makes it subjectively better. Here's an instance running on the mix bus using the A-type companding, and listen to what happens when I turn it off. Those differences are pretty significant to my ears. But the companding can also have a profound effect when running multiple instances to emulate a multi-track recorder. This instance is on the kick drum, but it's linked to other instances on snare, toms, overheads, and so on. So every element of the mix is passing through an instance with these settings before reaching the mix bus. So why the difference in sound? A couple of reasons, I think. First of all, any slight differences between the compression and expansion stages is going to quite literally create a transient designer effect. If the expander stage reacts too much or too quickly, then transients will be exaggerated, and vice versa. We also have tape in between, which compresses and saturates the signal, and this will change the way the decoder behaves. Even if the decoder stage is perfectly matched to the encoder, it will start to behave a little bit differently because of the effect of the tape. But also, the encoder stage changes the signal hitting the tape, and therefore changes the way the tape itself compresses and saturates. It's difficult to appreciate just how much, because so far we've been doing it properly, as it were. The decoder stage has been set to same as encoder, So we're always using the matching expansion and restoring the signal as accurately as possible. So let's try doing it wrong. But that's usually too extreme for the mix bus, so I'll switch to processing a loop of just the drums instead. Let's have the A-type encoder, but this time I'll set the decoder stage to none. That's quite a profound difference, because the A-type encoding is actually quite complex. U-He have obscured the names slightly, but it's not difficult to work out that A-type refers to the Dolby A noise reduction system. It might be reasonable to assume that Dolby A was the precursor to the more successful and well-known Dolby B, but in fact Dolby B was famous because it was the consumer version used in many cassette decks, while Dolby A was the much more sophisticated Pro version. Dolby A doesn't just use compression for the encoder stage, it uses multiband compression with 4 independent bands. The effect can often be a little too extreme, but fortunately we can dial it back if needed using the mix knob above. A-type mod is similar, but a bit different. I think the manual goes into more detail about the differences, but I can't remember exactly what they are. And that's kind of the point. This trick gives us complex parallel multiband compression, with all the finicky parameters hidden away under the hood. You can have more of it, or less, and you simply use your ears. I often find this trick useful for adding spice to synth parts, or an extra shimmer to an acoustic guitar. Okay, no prizes for guessing that B-type is meant to be Dolby B. This is much simpler than Dolby A. Still kind of multiband, but with companding only applied to the high frequencies. Using just the encoder stage is like compressing the high frequencies with too much makeup gain. This setup recreates the infamous Dolby B trick, where you recorded your cassette with Dolby enabled, but then played it back with Dolby turned off. This was a great way to squeeze an extra sparkly top end out of a crappy Walkman or Ghetto Blaster, and I made good use of the technique as a teenager. These days, with better equipment and more refined ears, I find I usually need to dial it back quite a bit to be useful. Okay, you ready for the next one? Let's try UHX Type 1. And that's not subtle. I'm assuming this is code for DBX, which I believe just uses full band compression and expansion. But there's also a healthy dose of EQ as well, which of course is normally corrected with an equal and opposite EQ in the decoder stage. If you've watched my older emphasis and de-emphasis EQ video, which I'll link to below, you'll understand how profoundly this will affect the way the tape saturates and distorts. Of course, it's way too much on its own, but when you dial it back with the mix knob, what you get is an EQ'd and compressed parallel chain, which, as we all know, can sound great on lots of different sources. Likewise with Type 2. The compression is different, and so is the EQ. But the principle is the same, and it gives you an easy parallel compression and EQ chain without the fuss and bother. So this has all been lots of fun, but we've not finished yet. If we can use the encoder stage on its own, what about the decoder stage on its own? And sure enough, fun stuff happens there as well. Here's the A-type decoder doing some powerful multiband expanding. Again, this is usually too much at full strength, but it can be surprisingly transparent when blended with some dry signal. Again, A-type mod is similar, but different. Less pumpy in the high frequencies. A little bit of this can be a great way to add punch and energy to programmed drum parts. Let's try the B-type. And this is like putting a blanket over your speakers. A bit extreme at full strength, but a little of it might be a good way to tame an overly bright and strident source. So you might have guessed that the next one is going to be quite extreme. And it doesn't disappoint. But blend some of this in subtly when you want a huge thumping kick drum. Or maybe try type 2, which thumps in a very different way. It's amazing how much fun you can have with just these two parameters and a mix knob. But we haven't finished yet. We've used the encoder stage on its own and the decoder stage on its own. Now what happens if you use both stages but with mismatched settings? Obviously you're about to find out. Let's stick with UHX Type 2 for the decoder, back at full strength. Then pick UHX Type 1 for the encoder. How cool is that? But it gets better. Here's my favourite combination. A-type encoding with A-type mod decoding. Isn't that glorious? Other combinations can get a bit kooky sounding, but they're all potentially useful with the mix knob dialed back. I'll let you explore those, however, because I've still got one more trick to show you. Being able to use just the encoder or decoder stage means we can set up an encoder in one instance of Satin and a decoder in another instance. We can even bypass the tape and the record EQ so that they're doing nothing else. And now we can put something else in between. Pick any distortion or saturation plugin you like. And it will sound wildly different inside a Compander. Once again, I'm touching on similar concepts to the earlier video I mentioned. Link below. But this time, instead of just emphasis and de-emphasis EQ, we're also manipulating the dynamics of the signal before and after the nonlinearity. It doesn't matter whether it's tape in between the encoder and decoder stages, or some other nonlinear plugin. The effect is as if the distortion becomes more dynamic. It backs off and distorts a little less for louder signals, while quieter signals are saturated more than they would have been otherwise. The effect is especially complex with Dolby A-type multiband companding, which optimises 4 separate frequency bands and helps to keep them in the sweet spot where there's tasty saturation, but not too much distortion. And that kind of sums it up, really. Companding helps to keep the signal in the sweet spot, and often makes that sweet spot sweeter still. And that's why U-He modelled it in Satin. I'm not actually aware of any other plugins that give you these type of companding features to play with. Let me know in the comments if I've missed anything. That's all for now. Don't forget to compress the like button, then expand your subscriptions by adding my channel. And before I go, a shout out to all my new channel members. I didn't expect to sign up so many so quickly, and that's very gratifying. Thank you for supporting the channel. And thank you all for watching.